Welcome to another edition of Inside Town Hall. I'm Jim Cameron. I am the host of this program and the program director of Darien TV 79. Inside Town Hall, as you, the faithful viewer, knows, is a program where we interview all the folks that help run our town government. Our guest today on the program is Jack Davis, the man who knows more about the budget writing process in Darien than any other individual, with the possible exception of our town finance director and maybe the guys on the board of finance. But Jack, welcome to Inside Town Hall.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Before we start talking about the budget and how it gets created and how it gets morphed in the process before it's approved, let's talk a little bit about your background. People may recognize you. They've seen you at all kinds of meetings asking questions. And people have told me and asked me, who is that guy? And so who is Jack Davis? What's your professional background?
I worked for both Price Waterhouse and Ernst & Young, who were at that time two of the big 8 accounting firms. They're back down to 4 now. Moved into banking with a specialty in what you call project management, where I've actually taught project management and a couple other courses for the American Management Association. The bank that I was working for was acquired by Chase. I helped do the integration of that, then worked on integrating other Chase purchases, and from there moved to different parts of the organization, eventually ending up in a greenhouse group that created new products for the basically commodity products. Then went to MasterCard to do the same, and eventually set up my own consulting practice.
How long have you lived in Darien?
Approximately 37 years.
That sounds more than approximate. It sounds pretty precise. The man is specific when it comes to numbers, I can tell you. How long have you been on the RTM?
That I'm going to give you a range. I think it's about 20 years. I joined after my kids had grown older, so I could spend some time with them when they were younger. I joined because the town lost several $1 million because we failed to issue certificates of occupancy on a timely basis. And so I joined TGSNA, which deals with our ordinances, did some changes there of looking at what was going on, and then entered into the F&B, where the first year I worked on the town budget. Actually, Seth Morton was chair of that committee at the time. That moved over to Bruce Orr, who later became part of the Board of Finance. He really had tremendous knowledge of this town and did a good job mentoring me. I've been running the Board of Ed side for most of that, and about 6 years ago, when maybe it's a little longer, when Jim Palin moved to the Board of Finance, I was elected by our peers in the group to be the chair of this committee.
How many people are on F&B, which is the Finance and Budget Committee of the RTM?
We've had a maximum of 17, but we're now about 12 or so. A lot of people just feel that we meet a lot, and therefore it's a big commitment because it's not only our meetings, but other board meetings.
And those folks on the Finance and Budget Committee of the RTM, they have a background in finance?
Not always. It's an eclectic group. They have expertise, and it's really a good team. I mean, I know people refer to it as a committee, but a lot of people bring various expertise to the committee, and that's been really helpful for the town as well as the committee.
And you say that they meet a lot. How often do you meet, and do you meet outside of the budget cycle of introduction and review and approval?
Since our main goal is primarily dealing with the finances, we're either primary or secondary on most RTM resolutions that come before our legislative body. So we meet at least once, sometimes twice a month. During the budget season, we can meet three times during a month. And by the way, budget season goes to April. And we've made some changes so that essentially right after the Board of Finance completes their budget vote, we've already done enough of our work that I joke within a day later, we could vote on that same budget. But then we attend Board of Finance meetings, Board of Selectmen meetings, and also Board of Education meetings throughout the year.
Let's talk about the town's budget, and we'll kind of break it down as to which part goes to which part of the town. But overall, and we're recording this interview in February of 2023. How big is the town budget?
Town budget, I can at least say last year, and there's going to be increases this year. Last year, the total town budget was approximately 160 million, but that did include us bonding certain capital items. So it was bigger, but because we bonded it, we didn't have to tax for it.
So of that 160 million or so, how much goes to the Board of Education versus the operation of the town?
That's a little tricky question. The Board of Ed's budget, and I'll deal with last year's numbers. The Board of Ed was approximately 111 million. The town was about 38 million. And what I'm pulling out is 10 million was debt service. And that I consider to be a Board of Finance decision because they create the structure for our debt. We all approve it, but ultimately they create the structure for that.
And on both of those sides, the town side and the Board of Education side, there are operating expenses and capital expenses. What's the difference between those?
Capital is long-term investment. It can be as small as 18,000. It can be as small as 5,000, but they have to have at least a 3-year life. Those with longer lives, typically we look to see if we can bond them. But
capital is things, right?
yes, it's really things: buying trucks, fire engines, repairs to our parks, public works improvements, infrastructure. That's the best way to think of it. It's a lot of infrastructure.
And on the operating side, what's involved with that? I assume the biggest chunk of that is personnel costs.
It is. A large part of it is personnel costs. And then it's just some services that we have to do. In the Board of Ed, technology, even though that has a large dollar amount and has a 5-year life, is included in the operating budget. That was a decision made a number of years ago when Murray Stegelman was chair of the Board of Finance.
Jack Davis is our guest today on Inside Town Hall. He is the chairman of the RTM's F&B, that's the Finance and Budget Committee. So how does each side, let's take the Board of Education first, because that's, as you say, it's the biggest chunk of the town budget. People wonder, why do my taxes go up every year? And I guess part of the reason is that the town's spending goes up every year. So the Board of Education, how do they start building their proposed budget, and when?
The Board of Ed's budget is actually started during the summer when they set up what the goals are for the year. And so everything's based off those goals. Now, yes, there's personnel. Yes, there's operating costs. Yes, there's supplies, transportation, heating, buildings, and other things like that. But most of it is off those goals. So the goals are discussed by the board. It's presented out in the public. The department chairs then take information that they've had before. They submit it to the superintendent. The superintendent and the director of finance and operations reviews that and comes together with what is, at that point, the superintendent's budget.
And do each of these departments start with what I think has been referred to as zero-based budgeting? Or do they take what they've been doing this year and add X% and say, okay, we're just going to keep doing what we've been doing, but it's going to cost us a bit more?
That's a trick question. Both of our boards claim to do zero-based budgeting as opposed to just building off of last year. I can't confirm or deny whether or not they're doing it. I tend to believe it's a little combination of both.
So costs go up, there's inflation, but as you say, the biggest part of both budgets is the operations side, which is personnel. And there's a lot of acronyms that get tossed around in the budget cycle, but one of the acronyms people hear a lot is FTEs. What's an FTE?
It's a full-time employee. So that's, one person working for the number of hours that they do is one FTE. But in certain instances, in certain classes, we may only need a 0.4 FTE to teach a particular class. And so that's arranged by having people have multiple specialties, but they break it down that closely.
But that full-time employee is not only receiving a salary, but there are other costs involved with adding FTEs too, right?
Well, the biggest, on the Board of Ed side, the biggest cost is healthcare. Remember, the professional staff, teachers and administrators, their pension is picked up by the state. For non-professional staff, there is pension also associated with that, and Social Security. Interesting enough, in the state of Connecticut, teachers and administrators and professional staff, be a social worker in that, do not pay Social Security. They also cannot collect Social Security in retirement.
So the full-time employees that are on the staff, either of the Board of Education or of the town, are any of them unionized? Are you dealing with long-term contracts so that you know that the teachers, for example, are going to get a bump in salary this year and a bit more next year?
There are 7 unions on the Board of Ed side. I mean, on the town side, rather. And there's 2 unions that we deal with specifically. There may be more, but the main ones we deal with is the teachers union, administrative contracts, and that. And the teachers go first, and then the administration seems to follow. But there are a lot of unions there.
Now, on the capital side, the things side, you mentioned that the Board of Education treats technology as an operating cost, I guess because it has a shorter lifespan. But things that they're going to be buying, let's say the fire departments are going to need new fire engines. Are they planning ahead so that they know, or do they wait for something to break down and then come and say, yeah, but the XYZ truck's not working anymore?
Okay, so let me back up a little bit, because actually the 2 budgets are different. while we elect our Board of Ed members, the authority for our Board of Ed comes from the State Department of Education, and we provide them with a total budget. We do not have line item veto on their operations. We do have it on their capital. On the town side, we have line item veto on their operations and on their capital. Line item veto means if we don't like this one expense in a line item, the Board of Finance or the RTM can reduce it. On the Board of Ed side, we have to do a blanket reduction, let's say 200,000, maybe because we didn't like the color they wanted to paint the field for some reason, or a program that they're doing. We could cut the 200,000, but the Board of Ed could still operate that. So that's one of the big differences. And the reason why technology was moved back into the operations is because when that was done, technology was becoming a greater part of the educational experience. And the Board of Ed, rightfully so, did not want their technology that was integrated into their instruction cut. So that stayed in the operation side, and the Board of Finance at that time was smart enough to recognize that.
And both on the town side and the Board of Education side, there are professionals whose job is full-time to be building the budget, looking at the operating expenses. I mean, there is somebody like in the case of the town finance director, but there's a counterpart as well too on the Board of Education, right?
Let me say that we've had every month a report comes out. Rich Rudel is the director of finance and operations
At the Board of Education.
On the Board of Education.
Right.
The very detailed report, the full budget, over nudges on their budget variances are calculated, explained throughout the school year. So that's presented to the subcommittee of the Finance Committee on the Board of Ed, then presented at the full Board of Ed meeting. On the town side, and I'm going to say this town is extremely lucky to have the town administrator that we have, Kate Bush, and Jen Chinesky, who is the director of finance. They do an excellent job. At one time, Kate, before she became town administrator, was the director of finance. They save the town significant funds and get involved in helping the Board of Finance, the director of finance, on bonding issues and that. Jen also, during the Board of Finance meeting, presents a monthly result on budget, which is rather sophisticated, but very easy to read. Lists all of our outstanding debts, which ones have been issued, what hasn't, deals with several contingency accounts that are within the town budget, deals with the capital accounts that are there. It's a very quick read, honestly, but it's very detailed. And so there should never be a question of what's going on during the course of the year in comparison to the budget. They're available.
Jack Davis, our guest today on Inside Town Hall. He is the chairman of the RTM's, which is the RTM is the Representative Town Meeting, Finance and Budget Committee. And full disclosure, I am also a member of the RTM, but I have never been on Jack's committee because I have absolutely no expertise when it comes to finance. He would not want me there.
I'd always want you, Jim. You ask good questions.
Well, thank you. That's my job. I'm here to ask questions on behalf of the audience. So you were mentioning that one of the tricky things about the Board of Education budget is that once it's approved, they can change their mind as to how they're going to spend it. If they have come and said that they want to do something on the operations side, they don't necessarily have to do that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, many years ago, I think John Bolton was the chair of the Board of Ed at the time. I was quoted in the Darien Times. The budget was a lot smaller then, saying if the Board of Ed wanted to change all the placeholders they gave us and buy $50 million of crayons, theoretically they could. Now,
How did he take that comment? Was he pleased with that?
he left. John has a very good sense of humor, although they'd probably end up in jail because there's legal contracts that we have. But basically, what we see during the budget is really placeholders. And there can be transfers that go between accounts on both the Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen. On the Board of Ed side,
That's after the budget's approved. I mean,
after the budget's approved,
Right.
the Board of Ed can transfer within a category. So if they want to move money from one salary department to another salary department, they can without board approval. If they're moving money from the salary to, let's say, building maintenance, they need Board of Ed approval.
Mhm.
So that's the differences, but they have full control once we've given them that lump sum.
Right. Now, you mentioned that when it comes to capital expenses, that's things that they're going to buy. Sometimes those are bonded and sometimes those are paid for in that year's budget. How do they make that decision, and what's the benefit of bonding over paying for something immediately?
Well, I will say prior to Powell's increase of the Fed rate exorbitantly, we did a lot of bonding because essentially it was free money. We were paying
Interest rates were very low, you're saying.
They were very low. And we could then pay for an item over 20 years, which really benefited the taxpayers. One of the keys here is that it allows you to spread it out. Rates are higher. So we'll see how the Board of Finance addresses some of the items that might have been bonded in the past to what's going on. Now, one of the things that F&B sort of pushed through in conjunction with the Board of Selectmen is that in the past we used to accrue for our fire engines. And that meant that people who might never see that fire engine were paying for it through their taxes. F&B is a firm believer that people get the use of the asset should pay for the asset. So we now bond that. And that actually has saved about $10 million of taxes to our taxpayers over the next 10 to 15 years. We're still going to make those payments, but when they come due, instead of worrying about an annual accrual that wasn't guaranteed that we would make it, we bond, and then that's paid over 20 or even 25 years, which we have.
So by bonding something, if you bought something over 20 years, you'd put 1/20th of it aside every year and either pay off those bonds or, pay the interest on the bonds. And as you say, it spreads out the cost over what is hoped will be the useful life of that item, right?
And in fact, the taxpayers that are getting the use of that fire engine, because it's now received, end up paying for it instead of other taxpayers paying an accrual. And it may be 25 years before we actually purchase the next fire engine. But yes, there are schedules in the town side for fire engines, trucks. Both maintain a 5-year capital plan, which is discussed not only for what goes on this year, but also in future years. And all the capital has a priority, whether or not it's high priority, medium, or low.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and sometimes bonds get reissued, in effect, paid off because interest rates are lower, and then they can issue the capital appropriation again, right?
Yes, you can. Sometimes we amend them, which we did on the Holmes Henley Royal school construction, because we issued an initial bond for each one of them. And then once the final costs were known or estimated for what we had to give to the state, we amended the original bond. There's something else that we possibly will be doing something similar to at the next RTM meeting.
So let's go back to the process where we've talked about how each department let's say in the school, let's say the math department puts its budget together and they present it to the full Board of Education, and the Board of Ed, and on the town side, same thing's happening. Human Services has come and put its budget together, and both the town and the Board of Education go through the proposed budget, and each of them, let's say, approve the proposed budgets on the town side and the Board of Education side. What happens to those proposed budgets then? Where do they go?
Well, let me step back for one thing, and I don't want to belabor it, but the Board of Ed presents their budget on a single Saturday. It's a rather long day, but the RTM Education Committee is there, F&B is there, Board of Finance is there, the School Association, CDSP is there, CPAC, which is another organization, is there. And after each department, questions can be asked, they're recorded, and the answers to those questions end up on the website, and that continues. Then the RTM Education and F&B Committee do a presentation to the board of our preliminary thoughts. And any other questions, Board of Finance has the opportunity to do the same. Those questions are submitted and answered. So there's an iterative process throughout the entire time. And I should mention, there's public comment in the front of every one of those meetings. So if somebody has a concern, whether or not they're for or against something, they have the opportunity to do.
It's a very transparent process, right?
Yeah, it is very good. And then, by the way, the Board of Ed has a public hearing. So that's slightly different than the Board of Selectmen. Board of Selectmen, as they go through various departments, members of the RTM or other commissions, or in fact, since we give the library a grant of about $4 million for its operations, they produce presentations, we can ask questions, but it's only really the main areas that they go through. In other words, the harbor master, which has a small budget, isn't presented because it won't make a change in the taxes.
Right.
So,
but your point is that the RTM and the Finance and Budget Committee, specifically the RTM, is the last piece of the budget approval process, but you're engaged even as it's being created. So there won't be surprises by the time the budget comes to the full RTM for its final approval, right?
there shouldn't be surprises when the budgets go to their boards, because for the most part, we expect, as the boards do, that major initiatives are discussed consistent with their goals and objectives throughout the year. They've been covered in a meeting. There's documentation supporting that. It's not to say there's not surprises. There always is. Otherwise, life wouldn't be interesting. But the fact of the matter is so yes, there's a lot of people that are engaged throughout the year. Like Park and Rec goes to Park and Rec Commission, so they know what's going to be presented because that's their expertise. The Public Works meets with Ed Gentile, Public Works Director. The Planning, Zoning, and Housing meets with Jeremy Ginsburg, who heads our building land use areas throughout the year. So,
and these
they
are all
know what's
RTM
coming.
committees that you're mentioning too.
Yes.
Right. Okay, but let's go back. Let's say the Board of Education has approved its proposed budget. The town has approved its proposed budget, the Board of Selectmen in that case. Where do those proposed budgets go next?
Okay, next, there is a legal date for which both of those boards present to the Board of Finance. Now, one of the accomplishments that F&B initiated back about 6-7 years ago was that we set up something at that time which was called the buddy system. And that said that people were assigned areas of the budget by the Board of Finance. We assigned other people from the F&B committee to review the budgets together so that there was no surprises to the Board of Finance. If we might not have agreed with something, they can be discussed. We've subsequently added the various committees so that it's a joint budget review team of the RTM and the Board of Finance which would include the specific committee, F&B, and the Board of Finance. And they discuss it and then present it to the Board of Finance, who will make their final decision.
And do you guys get along with the Board of Finance? I mean, do you ever disagree with what they're going to do?
Well, it wouldn't be a good relationship if we agreed with them all the time. Agree with the board sometime. Sometimes we're able to change what we believe. We've done that by cleaning up the reserve accounts, by cleaning up, which generated significant savings to our taxpayers by moving the bonding forward. We also cleaned up the capital accounts in conjunction with the Board of Finance. We introduced a capital form so that everybody lists what the capital is in greater detail than what we used to hear. And there's a lot of other things that we've done. The best way to do it is if the RTM and the respective boards work together. Our big thing now, which we introduced last year, is to explain the budget. We talk about what the core growth is. This is their main business, increasing the core business. And then what's new growth? I'm hiring new FTEs? Am I starting a new program? So that we can do the comparison of what's going on. So yes, there are times we're going to disagree. There's times we disagree within the F&B committee. But that's part of how we work the budget out. I think overall we have a reasonably good relationship with the Board of Finance.
So the Board of Finance, which receives the proposed budgets from the first selectman on the town side and the Board of Education on the education side, they can cut things. Can they add things? Can they go? I mean, has the Board of Finance ever said, Board of Education, we don't think you're spending enough on X. We want to put more money in your budget to do that. Do they need the Board of Education's approval to do that?
Nobody ever adds to the Board of Ed. And the reason is why I explained the budget. We could say, here's $200,000 to teach German in our schools. But again, once we approve the overall appropriation, the Board of Ed doesn't need to do what we gave them the money for. So on the operation side, no one is adding money to the Board of Ed budget.
Do they do they suggest cuts?
Yes, but again, it's a high-level cut because somebody may not like the fact that we're teaching Mandarin Chinese, and so they want to cut it. But that doesn't mean after we cut, let's say, 100,000, that the Board of Ed can't run Mandarin Chinese anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Board of Selectmen is a little bit different. Part of what the Board of Finance does is they can add to revenues. And we've done so in the past. We've added to the town clerk revenue based upon the increase in sales volume, which we had underestimated for a number of years. They can increase the investment income. They can also reduce certain revenues that they feel might be a little bit too high. But the big thing that the Board of Finance does, besides reviewing the budget, making additions and cuts, is they determine how we're going to pay for this. That's their key role. There's only one instance in which the RTM can initiate a bond, and that's if we're doing a supplemental tax. Other than that, all bonding needs to be designed and approved by the Board of Finance and then presented to the RTM. They also have the right to pay for capital items from the general fund, which is the big bank account for the town, but it can only be used for capital and not used for operations. There's also a couple of other little funds. They have a capital contingency fund that they can use as well. So they get to decide how we pay. The RTM then approves that. And because we have the last approval, and this is a little bit controversial in this town, all towns that have a Board of Finance and an RTM have both the RTM and the Board of Finance being budget making authorities in that town. We're the only town that hasn't bought into that totally, although I believe a majority on the RTM believe that after the pandemic year.
Jack Davis is our guest today on Inside Town Hall. He is the chairman of the RTM Finance and Budget Committee. So the Board of Finance receives the proposed budgets. They decide what they might want to bond as opposed to pay for that year out of taxes. And I think you were saying earlier, and again, I'm not the finance guy. That's why you're our guest today. The things they decide to bond mean that the taxes may not go up as much this year. They're going to be spread out over a few years. But that's the Board of Finance's decision on what to bond and what not.
That's correct. But then the RTM needs to approve those bonding issues. That's
Right.
part of our responsibility as well.
How much debt service does the town have? How much have we bonded in the past? And how much of that indebtedness is still with us and will be for a while?
So, hot off the presses, since I spoke to our director of finance earlier today, currently we have about 77.7 million in outstanding debt. But just because we approve a bond issue, and I'll give an example of something we did recently, the RTM Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and the RTM approved a new fire engine for about $1 million. Now, we will not bond that until another 2.5 years later, maybe even 3, because we pay on, in this particular engine, we pay on delivery, and we're not going to receive it until that time. So while we authorize the $1 million in bond, it may not hit our books for another 2 years before we do it. So as I mentioned, we currently have about 77.7 outstanding. We've paid down about 8 million already this year. But more important is at the end of December this year, we had over 200 million in authorized but unissued debt. Now, that sounds like a lot, but it really comes down to 2 projects that we're doing. The first one is we have 103 million outstanding for Great Island. And when that gets resolved, the Board of Finance will determine how to structure that debt, which is also part of their job, and they do a great job of that. The other is about $82 million for the rehabilitation of the 3 schools, the Henley Homes and Royal Schools. We haven't issued any debt on that yet. So that's 82 million that will probably be issued over the next 3 years.
So the Board of Finance decides how much of the budget for both the schools and the town side they're going to bond. There are more public hearings. There's a public hearing before the Board of Finance on all of the budgets, the town and the Board of Education side. And let's say the Board of Finance approves the budgets. What happens then?
It comes to the RTM. Now, F&B for the most part has been structured, not that we do it, but jokingly, within 10 minutes after the Board of Finance has approved the town budget, we should be in a position to approve the budget because we've walked through the process. We've explained where we agree, where we don't agree. And if we're not going to propose any reductions to the budget, we're good to go. But it will go to all the committees. We become primary on budget night, with the exception of the education budget, which the RTM education
And when you say primary, let's just explain how the RTM works a little bit here as well, too. There is a group called the Rules Committee, which is elected by each of the districts of the RTM. And you actually are not only chairman of F&B, but you are also on the Rules Committee. Is that right? Still?
That's correct.
Right. And the Rules Committee, when an issue is coming up for a vote in front of the RTM, says, okay, the expertise on this particular issue resides with the RTM Education Committee because it's an education issue. But anything that involves money also involves your committee, the Finance and Budget Committee. So when you say you are primary, that means the Rules Committee has said, Jack and F&B have got to take a look at this because it involves money, and nobody follows the money better than Jack does. So you are our F&B, Finance and Budget Committee, is always going to be reporting on anything that involves money, right?
That's correct. But also in the charter, even though something might have been for the schools, if we're going to bond it, we take the lead on that, but we're only reporting on the bonding and the cost of the bonding. The detail belongs to the committee, not to F&B. We'll give a very high level on it, but it's the committee's job to explain what it is. The reason why we'll take something on bonding is the charter does say that the RTM F&B committee is the liaison between the Board of Finance and the full RTM. So we take a lead on that. And so on budget, we'll go through the high level numbers, and then the committees will report on what the details are in their specific purview, and what the changes are, what's going on, and increases there.
So the big meeting of the RTM that deals with the town budget is held when? April, May? I know it's sometime May.
It's
okay.
May.
That's a big meeting. And having been on the RTM for 20 years, I think there are some times where we take the Board of Education side as one issue, the town side as another issue, and sometimes they're lumped together, are they not? Or is it always separated?
We vote on the operating budgets for education and the town separately. But when we're voting on the town side, included in the town budget is the grant to the library. It equals all of the capital remaining that wasn't bonded or paid for by other things for both the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen and the debt service. So it's not just the town side and their operating budget. It's the combination of all those. We also do some house cleaning because there's certain reserve accounts such as the sewer authority, the parking authority, a new special revenue for Park and Rec that, and there will be for Great Island should the purchase go through. Not that I'm anticipating it won't, but once that does, there'll be a special revenue for that, where we need to approve certain appropriations and transfers to their account, even though on the sewer authority and parking authority, they're self-contained, which means whatever income they take in pays for their expenses. So
that night of the RTM where we're going over the entire budget step by step, there are some years where there is no questions, there's no debate. Each of the committees reports, and because they've been so involved in the process along the way, there haven't been any really surprises. And there's a vote, and it's usually near unanimous. But there are some years where people start to object about individual items in the budget. And is it too late? Should they have been involved earlier and try to make that change before it was approved by Board of Finance and sent on to RTM?
So I'm going to say in the last 8 years, there were 3 challenges to the budget, all of them on the Board of Selectmen side. The first one was when Jim Palin was still the chair of the F&B committee. That following year, he was elected to the Board of Finance, so that was his last year on F&B. And there was a challenge based upon some information that was had. The challenge was raised, it wasn't on line items, and it was defeated. All right. The next challenge happened in the pandemic year, and all of them were on capital. And although the Darien Times reported that there was an outrage on that F&B proposed these cuts, two of them passed with over 80 in favor and less than 10 against. So I'm not sure what the Darien Times was reporting on in that one.
Don't believe the Darien Times. They're selling newspapers, okay?
The one for Park and Rec passed like 60-30 to make those cuts, but it was really a deferral on the Park and Rec one, as was one of the cuts on capital, which said come back with better estimates and we'll prove it, which we did. We cut 25,000 and the final cost ended up being 9,000 for both concession stands instead of one. On the fence for the fire department, we felt that there was enough open items within the capital account that should have paid for that. And that was how we were trying to force the cleanup of the capital reserve fund, which we eventually did, which generated significant savings to the town by moving a lot of the funds or accounts that were never really closed or contingencies, changing some of those and paying down that year's capital after it was cleaned up in a joint effort between the Board of Finance and the F&B. So
I know I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I think one of your goals is to make sure the town gets the kind of schools and services that it wants, but we're not paying higher taxes than we should. Is that fair?
Yeah, I believe that we need to invest in our infrastructure and our schools because that's part of the reason why this is a desirable town. Again, within reason. But our main focus is to make sure that we're not overtaxing our taxpayers. That's a consistent focus. Now, we're going to invest because we know we need to invest to keep it going. One of the things that I should mention is that the state of the town, the director of finance, sets guidance for budgets. And the last 2 years, it's been 3.5%. It's going to be tough to do 3.5% in this year for inflation. But you'll find that the Board of Finance and the RTM are reasonable people, and we understand some of this. But so there is a goal to start off. But part of what we like to do is clean up things and make sure that those funds are being returned to the taxpayer. If in fact we have ended up with significant balances being returned to the town at the end of the year.
But you also mentioned along the way there reserve funds. And one of the things that I know you're proud of is that the Finance and Budget Committee went through the budget and found all kinds of little pots of money that had been set aside and hadn't been spent yet. And I think you basically said, use it or lose it, spend it, but don't keep asking for more money until you've spent the money you've put aside. But there's also a rainy day fund. The Board of Finance is very proud of the fact that they have a reserve. Is that called the reserve fund?
It's a Board of Finance contingency fund.
How much money is in there? And
too much.
Okay. How much is too much?
It used to be about 400,000. We reduced it to 300,000, and Jamie reduced it to 250. So for most years, we don't spend more than $125,000. The 2 years more recently that we have was one a pandemic year, but it was also used for convenience because on the Board of Selectmen side, all the departments return money. And some of the items that they use in there, from my opinion, other than the beginning of the year, ended up with favorable variances. So it could have just as easily been a transfer from one part of that department to another part, but they just conveniently went to the contingency fund.
So a good point you're making here, because each of the town departments, when they get their budgets approved, if they don't spend that money in this fiscal year, it goes into the general fund, right?
That's correct. It's returned to both boards. Any extra money that they have at the end of the year is returned to the general fund, which is our big bank account. But there's some guidelines, at a minimum, it's going to be 12% of our expenses. On the other side of it, we really want to keep it above 15-16% because that's what the rating agencies are looking at. But we're up at about 17%. And so that gives us
17% of the entire town's budget is sitting in a bank account somewhere, being
well,
invested, I hope.
Yeah, it's being invested.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to say that it's basically available funds. As I said, we won't go below 12% because that's the guidance that the Board of Finance set. But we're about 17%, which generates some additional monies that can be used, but limits. They can only be used for a special appropriation, all right, or to buy capital or to pay down debt. So it can't be used for operations. We can't reduce our operating budget by transferring money out of the general fund. That's not how that works.
Uh-huh. Okay. So case in point, TV 79 gets an appropriation from the town to pay for camera operators and to pay for some equipment. We also get a lot of grant money as well, too. But I'm the guy that puts that budget request together. And every year I got to go, okay, well, how much did we spend last year? And how much do we think we're going to spend this year? And I don't think I've had a year in the 12, 14 years I've been doing this where I didn't have some money left over to put back in the general fund. Because my thinking is, and tell me if this is wrong, I don't want to run out of money and have to go hat in hand to the Board of Finance saying, I can't cover any more meetings because we ran out of money. Is that the mindset of most departments? Ask for a little bit more than you're going to need, but don't overspend.
Well, first, I will tell you that our department heads, and includes the Board of Ed, do a good job managing their money. All right. Some of the excess funds that we're getting back is, especially in the police department, there's certain jobs right now that are very difficult to fill. And for both the Board of Ed and our police department, we don't just put in a body. We have very high standards of who we employ in this town. And congratulations that they do that. But policemen are a very difficult task. And we've been running vacancies on those. We're still covering all the patrols that we need through overtime. And school teachers are now, and professional staff for schools has now arisen after the pandemic as being another difficult job to fill. So we end up with vacancies that.
But they've already kind of put money in the budget to pay for jobs.
We need to have, we need to have the jobs appropriated for the salaries we anticipate it will be. So even if we're going into a year where we know we're down 2 people, we still need those jobs in anticipation we're going to fill it. Now, I'm going to give you something from just my own personal opinion. TV 79 provides a tremendous service to this town. I'm able to not have to go to meetings during the course of the year and can turn on and look at the Vimeo and watch the meeting. I can fast forward for those parts of the meetings that I really didn't want to hear anyway. Um, and so recording all these meetings have made all of our minutes a heck of a lot easier. It also provides a service on just information and other things for the town. So yes, do not under budget. We need these meetings recorded.
Okay, Jack, I think I'm going to raise my budget request for this year. That's very kind of you. Yeah, we run a very lean operation here. Our budget request, just for everybody's information, it's a matter of public record, $23,000 for the year. And that's chump change in this budget, I imagine, when you're talking about $100+ million, right?
Well, that's something else, but it's interesting that you mentioned. Most of the time when we're looking at what we're going to do on the budget, there's a sort of key number for what the number should be, and it's equal to what we call 1 basis point. So if our current taxes are 17.35, let's just say, 1 basis point up would make it 17.36, or 1 basis point down would make it 17.34. That number is $87,000. That's what it takes to move the needle. So, items for $10,000-15,000, we don't play with those. It's not worth our time. If a board wants to discuss it, that's great, but it's just not worth the time to discuss, because it's not moving the needle. We look for things that are going to move the needle.
Jack Davis is our guest today. I want to keep moving along here because we're eating up the clock here, and I hope we haven't lost people's attention, because this is a really important issue, but it's hard to kind of follow if you're, not watching everything on TV 79, and not even I watch everything on TV 79. Let's say that the Board of Finance has approved the budgets, school side and town side, and it's gone to the RTM, and the RTM has also approved the budgets. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of how we determine what the mill rate is going to be and how high our taxes are going to be. And one of the things that we haven't discussed, although we did chat about this with the town tax assessor, Tony Hamicki, is something called the grand list. Because now we know how much we want to spend, and then we got to figure out how we're going to appropriate those as taxes based on property values, right? So
Yes,
what is the grand list?
The grand list is the sum of the properties, including personal property, automobiles, and real estate.
And business properties too, right?
Right, I'm sorry?
Business property as well,
Yes,
too.
real estate being both consumer and commercial.
Right.
So that's adjusted for various reasons. And it's one of the reasons why we really focus on the expenses. The numerators, which is all the costs that we have less revenue, because that's the first deduction, tells us how much we need to raise through taxes. That's the numerator of the calculation. The denominator is the adjusted grand list. And I'm not getting into it. It's a little bit complicated. And to save time, just know that we adjust it. We don't control the denominator because that's market driven. And I'm sure in your interview with Tony, you've gone over that every 5 years we have a reval. And if a house that was worth for $1 million sells for $2 million, we don't add it to our grand list until the reval happens. This is new construction or innovation or new cars or other things like that. We have a really healthy grand list. And so by doing that, that then determines the mill rate. But there's a little hidden something there. This year, our grand list increased for the second year in a row about 1.5%. If we just keep the same mill rate as we're taxed this year, looking into next year, that 1.5% increase is generating $2 million of incremental tax revenue to the town. So it's almost as if that also comes off whatever those increases are beforehand. But that generates the mill rate, you divide it by 1,000, and you basically end up with what your tax rate is. So we can see overall expenses going up by 4%, but because of what we've bonded and based upon the increase in the mill rate, we could potentially see your taxes only going up by 3%, for an example. So that's why we focus on the expenses, not the mill rate.
And the budget is going to be approved in the spring of this year, but the tax reassessment required by state law doesn't happen until the fall of 2023, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. And whatever budget we approve now affects your taxes July 1st, your July payment and your January payment. It also affects something else, which sometimes we pull things off budget cycle, is that if we're approving a project, one cannot buy or purchase that capital project until July 1st. So which example in the past, we've needed to order Suburbans for the schools, we might pull that off of the budget cycle, approve it in April, which gives them 3 or 4 more months to purchase that so that they can get delivery for the start of the school year. So There's all these little nuances that we play.
Jack Davis, our guest today inside Town Hall. He is the chairman of the RTM, Representative Town Meeting Finance and Budget Committee. And as I said an hour ago when we started this program, there is nobody who knows more about this town's budget. You tossed me a bouquet for TV 79. Let me toss one to you. Jack, as a member of the RTM, your expertise is invaluable to help us understand this process, because you're there all year long watching this. It's not just a 3-month cycle through the budget year. But the last thing I want to leave our viewers with is your thoughts on how they can be engaged in this budget writing process and at what point they should have their voices be heard. When can they most affect a change if they want to see one in the town budgets?
Well, I'm going to start with something right from the beginning. I think it's important for the public to make comments throughout the year. And there's a number of ways you can do it. There's public comments on most meetings. It's only 3 minutes, but it's there. There's public hearings on certain issues, and that's important to make your comments. You can always write to the first selectman by email, Kate Bush by the town administrator, or Duke Deneen, who chairs our Board of Ed, or Jim Palin, who chairs our Board of Finance, or myself for that matter. There is a method in which you can submit to the town clerk and distribute it to the full RTM, your opinions on this. It's important to get involved on whatever is your favorite topic. It does have an impact, and your voices do mean something. You're not going to get what you want all the time, but you'll get what you need.
But early in the process as well, too, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, at the RTM final budget vote in the spring is not the time to say, nobody ever told me that the Board of Ed was going to do such and such. It's too late then almost, right?
Yes, the horse has already left the barn, so to say. So that's part of the reason why we pushed up everything from the RTM to working with the boards and the Board of Finance prior to the Board of Finance vote. That's essential. But we'd love to hear from you.
Let's leave it on that very optimistic, participative democracy message from our guest today on the program, Jack Davis, who is the chairman of the RTM Finance and Budget Committee. Jack, I really appreciate your service to the town. We are so lucky to have you. year in, year out. I'm as an RTM member, I'm grateful as well too, as I mentioned. And I want to thank you for joining us today on the program.
Thank you. I will say, I'm just the face of a very qualified group of team members. And so I'm honored to be their chair. And thank you for those kind words.
You're very welcome. Thanks for being on the program, and thank you, our ever faithful viewers, for watching yet another edition of Inside Town Hall.